Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I have a few things to go over before we get started, so I'm going to start doing that while people are still filtering in. My name is Shay Corey, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our fantastic speaker, Mr. Joe McGill, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who's helping to run the Facebook live stream. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I'd like to first start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Tracers Inc., KCE Structural Engineers, Quinn Evans, and David Schwartz Architects. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. February's Black History Month programs are presented in memoriam of longtime DCPL member Daniel R. Smith, Sr., who died October 19, 2022 at age 90. Prior to his death, Dan was believed to be the last person in the United States whose father was born enslaved during the Civil War. He was living proof that slavery is not distant history. You can read more about Dan's life on our website, www.dcpreservation.org. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. If you have anything urgent, you can message me. And for those of us joining us on Facebook Live, you can message Zach or leave a comment with your question, and we will get to that. And now that we've covered all of our housekeeping items, I'm so pleased to introduce you all to today's speaker, Mr. Joe McGill. Joe McGill is the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project and is a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. By arranging for people to sleep in extant slave dwellings that are vitally important to the American built environment, the Slave Dwelling Project has brought much needed attention to those often neglected structures. As of the beginning of 2018, Mr. McGill has conducted over 250 overnights in approximately 100 different sites in 19 states and the District of Columbia. He has interacted with the descendants of both the enslaved communities and of the enslavers associated with historic plantations. He speaks with school children and college students, and tonight he is speaking with us. So with that, I'm excited to turn things over to him. And Joe, the floor is yours.
Beautiful. Thank you for the introduction. DC Preservation League. This will, I think, be interesting. The Slave Dwelling Project, if we can have the first slide, please. Yes, again, thank you for the introduction. My name is Joseph McGill, founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. A Slave Dwelling Project is a simple concept. It finds slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and I ask the owners if I could spend the night in these spaces. And the reason is to bring attention to these spaces, because once upon a time, one could come to a site, a historic site, antebellum site, places where slavery existed prior to the Civil War, and you could visit these sites and learn about the beautiful historical architectural significance of the place. And in the historical information that's given about the place are disseminated is usually a white male involved in the good deeds and the good things that were done at that site. And those are worthy to be told. But missing from that story are the stories of enslaved people, the people who made all that possible, the people whose labor was stolen to make all of that wealth. The resources to build that house was stolen labor from those enslaved people, and people were enslaved in those spaces. And being enslaved in those spaces, the stories of their enslavement was not being told. The buildings where they inhabited still existed, still do exist, but the stories of the people who inhabited those spaces was not. So Visiting these places and noticing that that part of the story was not there, working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation at the time, knowing that it was possible to preserve buildings that exist, just refocus the attention to the places that weren't being talked about, and those places were slave dwellings. And with the National Trust for Historic Preservation having access to some of these places, constant access to some of these places, being a Civil War reenactor at the time, going to historic sites and reenacting battles where Civil War battles historically took place, and sleeping overnight, camping out overnight at these sites and roving from campfire to campfire into camps of men representing the Confederacy and having conversations with these men, sometimes scary conversations about, why they became reenactors. And of course, having the opportunity through the National Trust for Historic Preservation, having access and having the DNA that I possessed, all these things came together in this thing called the Slave Dwelling Project. And it's very simple, just asking the owners, the stewards of these places to stay there, to bring attention to those places, and bring attention to the places, then we could talk about the people if the places are there. It's harder to talk about people or tell stories if the places don't exist. And if you're lucky enough to get a sign that says here one stood, I mean, that's a conversation starter, but it's much better when the places are there. So the Slave Dwelling Project, for the last 12 years, I've been finding slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States and spending nights in them. But what you see before you there is an example of how I was educated in my state of South Carolina, where I'm from, born and raised in Kingstree, South Carolina, a very small town. And the history that I was taught in my formative years was the history of happy slaves and benevolent slave owners, which is not true, actually lies. And I had to purge my mind of all that to get deeper into my intent for the Slave Dwelling Project, ultimately to honor the enslaved ancestors. The narrative has to be corrected. So now 12 years later, what started out to be 1 year in the state of South Carolina, sleeping in slave dwellings in that particular state, this particular state, where my limited resources would keep me or take me, 12 years later, I'm still at it. And I've gone to 25 states and the District of Columbia, spending nights in slave dwellings, motivated by what you see there on the screen, the way they interpreted the lives of enslaved people. Let me see if I can read this. It says, life among the Negroes of Virginia in slavery time was generally happy. The Negroes went about in a cheerful manner, making a living for themselves and for those for whom they worked. They were not so unhappy as some Northerners thought they were, nor were they so happy as some Southerners claimed. The Negroes had their problems and their troubles, but they were not worried by the furious arguments going on between Northerners and Southerners over what should be done with them. In fact, they paid little attention to these arguments. So that's the that's the education. That's what was taught to me. I think that was the fuel, if you will, the kindle to that kind of started this fire within me. And because I had to prove all that wrong, and in the process honor the enslaved ancestors, it now manifests itself in the Slave Dwelling Project. So if we can have the next slide, please. Yeah. So there's been a lot of legislation lately to, just to quash this message or minimize the message of the Slave Dwelling Project, because it pushes back against a white male narrative a white male narrative that has been the history disseminated to we as Americans. And what's missing from that narrative are the voices of the Native Americans and the voices of the enslaved people and their descendants. More recently, there's been a lot of pushback to that narrative. It happened long before my lifetime. We have a Black History Month, to prove that Carter G. Woodson and all the work that he did to incorporate the African American narrative into the complete narrative. So it's been going on for quite a while. We've got the new museum in Washington, D.C. So we're making progress, but we're playing catch up. So there's always that pushback or those attempts to actually reverse what's being done or incorporating the narrative of Black folks into the overall narrative. And the Slave Dwelling Project is a part of that. But more recently, since the publication of the 1619 Project, there's been a lot of blatant pushback to the message of incorporating slavery into the narrative. And it has come in the form of states legislating that they don't want slavery taught to young kids because they feel that it's going to hurt their feelings, make them hate America, and make them hate themselves. So there's been a lot of that. So the Slave Dwelling Project has been going to a lot of these sites and touching a lot of these places and sleeping in a lot of these places. And we've been generating these conversations at these places because now it's more than just sleeping in these places. That was kind of the gimmick, if you will, the bait and switch, if you will, because sleeping at historic sites is easy. The hard part now, what we do is teach. I have a friend, his name is Damon Fordham. He's a tour guide in the city of Charleston, gives a great tour. So if you're in Charleston, look up Damon Fordham for a nice walking tour. He's also a professor at the Citadel. And he coined this term guerrilla teaching. And part of what the Slave Dwelling Project is doing is that guerrilla teaching, because while they legislate, we infiltrate. So we go to these places, and before we do these sleepovers, we have these conversations around the campfire. And in these conversations, we talk about things with people we don't know, people who don't look like us, and a lot of times don't think like us. We talk about racism. We talk about Confederate monuments. Should they stay or should they go? Getting married on plantations, white privilege, white supremacy, historical trauma, the death of George Floyd. All these things are on the table, and of course now the elephant in the room is anti-CRT and anti-woke. So we talk about these things around the campfire. So that's what we're doing now for all this pushback that we're getting. We're countering that by going into these places, sometimes behind the lines to do these things. The Slave Dwelling Project just published its 2023 schedule. So on that schedule, we are going to some places in some of those states where it has been legislated that they don't want kids learning about what the message that we bring. So next slide, please. So in this Slave Dwelling Project and some of the programs within, again, we've been doing this since 2010. May of 2010, Mother's Day of 2010, I woke up in a slave dwelling where I currently work. Was not working at the time when I slept there, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. And I was not familiar with the property. I slept there, I woke up, and I went for a walk, not knowing where I was going. I ended up in the cemetery. And in the cemetery, there are headstones. And some of the people who are buried there were born enslaved, and then died free. So they have headstones. Now, there are people who were born enslaved and died enslaved, but their graves are unmarked. So I'm there, I'm looking at these headstones of these folks, and I'm looking at just stones, and then I'm looking further into the woods and thinking, well, how many graves are in that wood line? You know, were they lucky enough to have been buried in a box that collapsed, and the earth on top of that box conformed to that collapsing, and maybe you could see that indention in the earth of where that grave is, because it's not marked, and that's one of the ways you could find it. So I knew that I was going on this journey for those folks, because when they were here on this earth, they were muted. They were deprived of their voice, their voice to demand the rights that were theirs all along. So I knew I was going on this journey for them. So now, 12 years later, 25 states later, I'm still sleeping in slave dwellings. So on the screen there, sites around DC where I've come and spent nights. So right there on the left, if you are looking at the screen in the manner that I'm looking at, right there on the left, you see the Octagon House, and that was a very good night. Um, what I've learned along the way is, um, when I was learning history, I learned about, I had history, I had slavery in a box at a plantation in the South, nothing else. So that limited knowledge, the things I missed out on in this institution of slavery was even in Charleston County. I work at Magnolia Plantation. What I was missing was urban slavery. All that urban slavery that took place in the city of Charleston was not what I learned about. Um, and then I also found out that I was missing Northern slavery completely. I had no clue that slavery existed in Northern states. But now, you know, I'm full of that kind of knowledge. So right there, the Octagon House. The Octagon House, for those of you who are in DC, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. But when First Lady Dolly Madison and James Madison, President James Madison, the British came and burned the Capitol and White House, and they moved the operation to the Octagon House, and they moved enslaved people with them. So that's why I stayed in the Octagon House. Now, I haven't stayed in the White House yet, but I think that once served as the White House, so I can kind of say maybe not. So, but I'm still working on that. We had a great conversation in that space. They had some beautiful programs throughout the day in the Octagon House. I want to try to make that happen again in the future. We also went to Gunston Hall. Gunston Hall was interesting. The young lady in the photograph, that's Linda Davis. She lives in Baltimore. I came up to DC for a conference, the National Trust for Historic Preservation National Conference that was held in DC. And by the way, that's going to be held in DC again this year. So I came up for that conference, and I asked my friend Linda to see if they were places that I could stay that fit the purpose of the mission of the Slave Dwelling Project. And she asked, I mean, she shopped around, and she found some places. Gunston Hall was one of those places. Now, some places told her no, because we were new to the scene, and people weren't that familiar yet with the Slave Dwelling Project. But we got a yes from Gunston Hall, and we went over there, and we had a great sleepover. A very limited number of people gathered for the conversation, but it was a good conversation nonetheless. The one there on the bottom of Gunston Hall, that looks like Ben Lomond, Ben Lamone. Um, yeah, I went there. That was interesting, guys. So check this out. You'll you'll I guess you'll get the connection as I begin to tell the story, continue to tell the story. So I went to that site, right? I went to that site in anticipation that we were going to be talking to school children. Um, well, when I got there, I found out that the school group was not coming. I know when I left Charleston to head that way, they were coming, but I got there, I found out they weren't. Well, here's the story. Someone had found out where the site was, and once people were enslaved there, and the message that I was bringing there was talking about the people who were enslaved there. So someone back at that time, and this was quite some time ago, which now I'm wishing I had the exact time, but it was very early in the process, and I've been doing this since 2010. And someone got upset, someone in the chain of command, or someone complained that they didn't want that message for that school, So the entire school group did not come. They did not show up. All right, so there's that. The top right there, that would be the Liberia House in Manassas. I've been going there for the last, I think, 3 years, and we've been doing some living history there, and some interpreting there. That has some very exciting, interesting Civil War history associated with the Liberia House. The photograph there on the bottom, that is bottom right, that would be Belle Grove Plantation. That's in Middletown, Virginia. I guess the reason I put it there is because I fly into DC to drive to it, so it's close. You guys can do it in a day. So we go there. Exciting, right? Because Kristen Lace, she is the director there. I met her in Savannah at another National Trust conference years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago, and she told me about what they were doing at her site at Belle Grove, and that they were reinterpreting, if you will, or telling the story, beginning to tell the story of people who were enslaved there, and of course she had me, from that point forward. So I've been going there. I think now for 6, 7 consecutive years, just to participate in that program that you see going on there. That's a group of students from one of the local colleges, and we're having our conversation. We're not doing it outside. We're doing it inside there. The time when we could do things inside and not be afraid. So we're having a conversation, and I recall once that one of the programs that we had, the gentleman who he brought college students from Pennsylvania. When he was trying to put the program together, he said he wanted to visit a plantation, a place where slavery took place. I said, sir, well, we don't have to leave the state of Pennsylvania. Slavery ended in Pennsylvania in 1780. He said, oh, wait a minute. I said, I'm aware of that, but I want to go a little further south to a plantation. So I had this good rapport with Christian, and we arranged for the kids to come and be a part of that. They came from Pennsylvania. The name of the college escapes me right now. Bloomsburg College is the name of it. So we had a beautiful time talking about again those things that we talk about in those circles, like that. So that is a way that the Slave Dwelling Project has evolved from just allowing people to sleep in these places to now being this opportunity to have conversations about those things that most people don't bring up in amongst people who don't look like them. But this is that opportunity to do just that. And the Slave Dwelling Project has been, you know, promoting this more recently. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, other sites around where you guys are. So right there to the left, that would be Monticello. Yeah, no, I'm sorry, that's Montpelier. That would be Montpelier. That's the home of James Madison, you know, father of the Constitution, we the people. So yeah, so what we were doing there, guys, we built the cabin, that log structure behind us. We built that. Um, so we got there. I mean, we we kind of cheated. You know, it was we were going to build a cabin from the ground up. But when we got there, the logs were already there. Well, the trees that would become those logs that you see, we had to make them those logs. So that was us. That's how it worked. And I took part in that, and it gave me an appreciation for all the work that it took to make a log cabin, and thinking about the frontier and people out there doing that. And a lot of time that work is it would have been slave labor. You know, I don't know if a crew of white folks, as you see there in the screen, would be out in the wilderness making a cabin. But we got to do that, and we got to bond. We got to bond with those folks. That cabin now exists at that site. I've slept in it. I've slept in it with descendants uh, of people who were in. Well, let me back up. I was supposed to sleep in it with descendants of people who were enslaved there. They came. We had the conversation, but they could not muster the courage to sleep in the place. But what we got was great. So if you look at the photograph at the top there, top left, or top in the middle there, um, that would be the same site. That is also the home of President James Madison. But I wanted to take it from that angle because those are the recreated slave cabins, and they were built in accordance with the archaeological work that was done to prove that they were in the spot that they now stand. So yeah, I've slept in there a few times. We've had those conversations at the home of the president. You know, we talk about things like, you know, in that nice, beautiful big house is the man that we call the father of our Constitution. Um, but you know, it's a constitution that it read "We the People," but here we are in the place where people were enslaved. So it lends itself to those kinds of conversations. So if you go to the bottom of that, you see slavery at Monticello. Yes, slept there also. You know, we've got Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. Well, he enslaved 600 people. And of course, there's a Sally Hemings story. And speaking of the Sally Hemings story, so I'm there. Both times I've stayed there with the descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved there. So the conversation got so intense that um, there is a faction of that group, the descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved there, who want to believe that the relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson was consensual. And then there's the rest of them. It got so contentious that I had to physically step in between, you know, two guys who were about to come to blows, you know, over that issue. So again, these are the opportunities that these places lend for us to have those kinds of conversations. So if you look up to the right, top right there, if I knew if I asked the question, you know, queried the group, if you had the capability of answering the question, you know, if I asked you where that is, that photograph, I would wager that 75% of you wouldn't know. But let me go ahead and let you know where that is. That is That's Mount Vernon. That's where, George Washington enslaved people, and that's what I was focused on. That's the place that interests me at that spectacular site. All else that they interpret is great and is worthy of being interpreted. But for me, at whatever site it is, it's these spaces that I'm attracted to. Uh, when I first started the Slave Dwelling Project back in 2010, I would go to sites, and the first thing the stewards of these sites would want to show me is the nice, beautiful big house. And I was vocal about not wanting to go, not wanting to take them up on that. Um, and I wouldn't. But here's what I learned. I learned that whenever those opportunities presents itself, I should go into the big house, because in the big house we can interpret slavery also. We can interpret spatial segregation, SPATIAL, if I spelled it correctly. Spatial segregation. You can look into those nice, beautiful big house. You can peer in, and if slavery went on at that site, you're going to walk into the front door and you're going to see a nice, beautiful, grand staircase. But you should always look for that second set of stairs, because it's that second set of stairs where the enslaved people had access to those spaces. And a lot of these spaces are architecturally designed that if you want to keep the enslaved people who are interacting in those spaces hidden from others who are there mingling or whatever they're doing and being entertained, some of these houses are designed in that manner to do just that, to have these people function in these spaces, but in spaces where they're not seen, if the people in the house don't want them to be seen. So there's that. But back to the cabin there at Mount Vernon. That was the space that I was interested in. That's a cabin that I slept in. That's where we had that conversation about George Washington and all his thoughts about enslaving people and who he owned versus who his wife owned, and were those teeth really the teeth of enslaved people. And being at the site, it just you have those conversations, much deeper conversations. Now, it took me a while to get into Mount Vernon, because when I first started, again, a lot of folks had no clue of my intention. No, a lot of folks were not interested in my intentions. So from the time that we made the first request to the time it actually happened, 5 years had passed. So the fingerprints on the bottom in the bricks. So I talked about telltale signs and looking at graves and seeing if there's an indention in the earth. That's a telltale sign of our existence, our ancestors, enslaved ancestors' existence. Same for the fingerprints in the bricks, because in the making of bricks, you have this process where the brick has to be dried. The clay has to be brought to its consistency, to be placed in a mold, to be dried. And when that is dried, that brick has to come out of that mold so the other side of that brick can dry. And sometimes in the process, these bricks get a little stubborn, but these bricks still have to come out of these molds. And a lot of times that's when fingerprints were made in some of these bricks. So if you are at an antebellum site built prior to the Civil War, look for those fingerprints. If you know that those bricks are antebellum bricks made in kilns by enslaved people, look for fingerprints in those bricks. A lot of folks, they know that it's my pleasure looking at bricks. Sometimes they learn that if you're talking to me, and if we walk by a brick wall at an antebellum site, hey, I'm going to stop. You might as well cancel a conversation. I'm now looking for fingerprints. So that's one of those telltale signs. But if you go back to the photograph to the left, I said those beams used to be trees. Well, we had to make them those logs those beams that to compose that cabin, and the tools that we use. So when you go into another site, if you see those exposed beams like that, look for those axe marks in those beams. I'm almost certain in most cases, those axe marks were placed there by enslaved people. Um, to make that tree, that beam that it now is. So that's, another one of those telltale signs. And again, it's close to you guys. It's within it's within a day's journey. Okay, next slide, please. So the Virginia's governor's mansion. I got to spend the night, and it was very exciting to hang out with the first lady. She wrote a nice note there, as a result of what was going on, and I really enjoyed what was happening there. The place that I stayed above the kitchen. Historically, I think the place was built in 1810, or was it 1813? One of those dates. And built by slave labor, and they still have the court, where the enslaved people lived. That still exists. It's still there, and above, of course, on the bottom floor is the kitchen, because that's the way it worked. That separated the kitchen from the house, and so the kitchen is there, and above the kitchen is where we stayed when we went there. I took some living historians with me. Don Tavius to the left, you see there in the photograph. So we stayed there, and a friend of mine, Kelly Fendall Dietz, had redone the kitchen. She did some research. And she did what was necessary to recreate that kitchen, and people had access. People could come visit, and they could learn about that history, learn about the enslaved people who inhabited that space and did the work. That's a big governor's mansion. So there had to be a lot of work done, pretty much constant work being done by enslaved people, and that kitchen was interpreting that. And we left there all happy, with expectations of coming back. And then there was an election. So I'll put a period right there. We can go to the next slide. So yeah, I've gone to lots of places in and around DC. Some of we've already talked about. So if you look there, I'll just go through them as they exist on this list. Belle Grove in Middletown, Virginia, great times there. Ben Lomond in Manassas. Clover Hill is also in Manassas. Gunston Hall we talked about. Fendall House. Yeah, I stayed at the Fendall House. Yeah, Light Horse Harry Lee, Lee's father. Yeah, I stayed there in Alexandria, Virginia. You talk about urban slavery. That certainly was going on there. Liberia House in Manassas we talked about. Montpelier, lots of time there. Also at Montpelier, I had the pleasure of doing archaeological digs, and I learned to really respect archaeologists, because archaeologists are those people who can help us fill in the blanks, because we cannot be educated as enslaved people. We didn't leave that written evidence of our existence. So we have to get that evidence through other means, and one of those means is, of course, what lies in the earth. So I really respectful of archaeologists because of what I learned at Montpelier doing archaeology. Monticello, Mount Vernon, the Octagon House, Prince George's County. So for the past 5-6 years, I've been going to Prince George's County. I fly into BWI, which is very close to where you guys are. And I go somewhere in the county. They own a lot of properties in Prince George's County. One that stands out to me is Judge Duval. He was a Supreme Court justice who enslaved people, but that was not uncommon. I've stayed at John Jay's place in Rye, New York. John Jay was instrumental in ending slavery in the state of New York. and they did it legislatively. But while he was campaigning to do all that, he was enslaving people. So yeah, a tangled web. And I talked about Virginia's governor's mansion staying there. I'm checking the time here, 6:41. If we can go to the next slide, please. So racism doesn't stop; it evolves. So if we see what's going on today, as in the political climate if it's now being legislated that a lot of what the slave dwelling project does, they don't want this taught to some kids. So what we do, we just continue to do what we do. We have conferences. We've had 7 conferences so far. Last year, we had our conferences our conference at the College of Charleston. We're not having a conference this year, but our next conference, guys, and you guys need to hear this, is going to be somewhere in the northern state to be named later. At this point, I don't know what that northern state is. You know, you guys kind of lie there in the middle of it all. Hey, we can work our way north to you. It is north of where I live. So if you guys want to consider it, let's talk about that and make it happen. But we're going to continue to do what we do. Next slide, please, which I think is the last one. Yeah, there is a book, Sleeping with the Ancestors. It will be published June 6th. You can pre-order it. If you want to pre-order the book, just Google Sleeping with the Ancestors, and it'll pop up. I'm not a writer, but I got stories to tell. That's why I'm co-authoring the book with Herb Frazier. So yeah, so all that's happening. Let's check. I do believe that's the last slide, and if it is, I will yield to my host to see what's next.
Great, thank you so much. Let me stop sharing here so I can see the chat. So we do have a few questions. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have a question about site interpretation. So do you think that sites are getting better at acknowledging enslaved history, and what are the best forms of interpretation that you've seen for tourists who might spend 1-2 hours at a site?
Definitely getting better. Better, so much so that people are getting upset because they're hearing the story. And I think that's a good thing. Yeah, so there's been cases that played themselves out nationally, where people go to sites, and they put in writing, I was upset. I'm on vacation. I didn't go to this plantation to hear about slavery. Well, first of all, you're on a plantation, and because they're now interpreting that, then that shows the flaw within that system. This person, if that person had visited the plantation before, obviously she or he heard a story that made her comfortable, meaning that it was not about slavery, but yet she's on the plantation. So now when she gets there and she hears that story, she complains out loud. And because she complained out loud, others started to complain out loud, because if you get the right megaphone telling your story about how you got your feelings hurt because you heard about slavery at Jefferson's place, and you interpret it as tearing down your deity or your God, or whatever you think of him. If you take offense to the truths being incorporated into his into the storyline, into the narrative, then where's the problem? Who is the problem? So that's an indication that the narrative is changing. And those sites that fall into the category of whitewashing, or telling some fairy tale or Gone with the Wind version of history, those sites are becoming less to non-existent, which is a beautiful thing. But But now the pushback to that is coming from the political spectrum, trying to squelch, what teachers can do. And I think that I think sites can help fill that void. But here's the thing, some of these sites are tied to that same storyline, if you will, tied to those who want to not incorporate the stories of the enslaved people, for whatever reason they choose that they don't, they want to do it. But I think there are more sites in a position that where they could help carry the burden and tell the real history of these sites and help fill that void.
Yeah, I think that's great. Could you talk a little bit more about staying in sites of urban enslavement versus overnight experiences in a more traditional plantation or rural setting?
Yeah. Um, I think what I find in interpreting urban slavery, I think one of the best example is Old Alabama Town. That's the first site that I stayed when I'm left the state of South Carolina to sleep in a place. Again, it was not my intent to leave the state, but because I was working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and working in and representing the state of Louisiana and Alabama, just going to do my job loaned itself to the opportunity for me to just tack on a sleepover in a slave dwelling. So I went to Old Alabama Town, and it's in an urban setting. Always been in an urban setting. And what that made me realize, because going into that very early on, again, I initially called the project Slave Cabin Project, but then I went to Old Alabama Town and I looked at that dwelling, this brick two-story, four compartment. No, that's not a cabin. So I had to change the name to the Slave Dwelling Project. Of course, the closer to the house, the better the cabin or the dwelling is, because the owner of that house is flaunting his wealth. That house is going to be seen by whoever visits that place. So these slave dwellings are usually made of the same material as the nice, beautiful mansion is made of. And so that that kind of lends itself to want to adorn, if you will, the spaces within. If you're setting it up for interpretation, a lot of times we tend to pull that history that I said that I was taught, that slaves were happy and enslavers were benevolent. You want to pull those things from the pages and make it this space. Because I went into the place in Alabama, Old Alabama Town, and I saw a place where the person could sit and shave, all the tools for someone to sit and shave. I saw the chamber pot, which I know they would have had a chamber pot, so I'll give them that. I saw a nice comfortable bed, bed post, and I'm thinking to myself, would this space have been adorned with all that I see in this space? And that not only applies to urban settings, that applies to plantations. I've gone in slave cabins for field hands on plantations. I'm saying, well, no, would not have been here. So we tend to do that, whether we're interpreting urban slavery or slavery on plantations, and that's kind of what leads to that number one question that I get when I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. The family that owned it historically and still own it now, they're the Draytons. So the number one question that I get is, were the Draytons good slave owners? That's because these people were taught, like I was taught, that slaves were happy and enslavers were benevolent. So people who interpret these spaces or set up these displays in these places, sometimes there's some implicit bias on our part in setting up these spaces and wanting to make them look like more than they were. A lot of these places were they had the bare minimum. These people would be sleeping on ticks, that straw hair moss stuffed into material, laid out on the floor, and that's usually it in a fireplace. And yeah, so there's that.
Yeah. Have you been sleeping in dwellings that are both reconstructed and original? And do you notice a difference in maybe how those feel to you when you're sleeping there?
All of the above. No, I don't notice any feelings. I think I know where somebody's going with that. A lot of folks ask the question a different way. Well, what do you feel? Do you feel the ancestors? Do you feel the spirits? Or do you seek that? Do you seek that? No, I don't. I don't seek that. I don't seek to feel any way or another. My intent is to bring attention to these spaces, and let folks know that it's okay to interact with these spaces, and let the stewards of these places know that it's okay to tell the stories of the people who inhabited these spaces in a manner that it should be interpreted. Now, I do get some folks who come and they want to feel, they want to commune with the ancestors. Um, when I first started the project in 2010, I used to get these calls from these ghost hunting outfits, and I said, no, that's not what this is about. It's about bringing attention to these spaces so that we can bring attention to the people who inhabited these spaces, so that we could tell their stories. But it's never been my intent to feel. It's always been my intent to bring attention to. So to me, it's just another sleep. I lay my padding, my sleeping bag, and my pillow, and if nobody's talking to me, I'll be asleep before the second bounce. So it's no intent to feel anything. I tell you one thing I did feel one night. So I was in this space, and I felt something crawling on my arm, and I killed it. I woke up, it was a spider. And then as I was about to go sleep again, I felt something else. Same place, I killed it, it was a roach. So I put it the same place where the spider was. And I think I woke up about 3 a.m. and both those things were gone. So I don't know what happened to them. So I felt that.
Maybe not the best thing to feel when you're asleep.
But the mystery is, where did they go?
Maybe they resurrected. I don't know.
Maybe I provided food for something else that would have, attacked me had they not had that food that I gave to them. This peace offering, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you made it, so that's all that really matters.
There you go.
Our other question that I'm going to add a bit onto, they're asking, have you stayed in slave quarters within one of the bigger, fancier houses that you've mentioned? And then what I'll add on to that is, I think you touched on this a bit with the spatial segregation. Could you describe a little bit more about how architecture might play into that?
Yeah, I've stayed in a lot of big houses. A lot of times, a lot of times the slave dwellings don't exist. In most cases, they don't, because there was that attempt to get rid of these places for whatever reason. So yeah, I've stayed in a lot of big houses. And sometimes historically, the enslaved people stayed in those big houses. Sometimes not, but sometimes I go and I'll pitch a tent sometimes to sleep at a historic site where enslaved people once inhabited. But the spatial segregation is again just that. If you think about lunch counters, once upon a time, people who look like me couldn't sit at a lunch counter and be served. Or if we went into a theater, we had to go to the balcony, but there was a way of getting up there other than the entrance that the white folks would go in. So we kind of think about it. We kind of think about it in that sense. Think about those historic churches that were built during the time of slavery in antebellum period. and they got, they have balconies. Those balconies aren't for the white folks to worship. Those balconies are for the enslaved people who accompany the white folks who come to worship, because a lot of those balconies, you could barely see what's going on the floor in some cases. But it's for those enslaved people, and those enslaved people had their separate way of getting up there. Same applied. Same. And if you also think about the modern day form of segregation in buildings, sometimes this is just a velvet rope, a rope or something, or sign, whites only, black only, white water fountain, black water fountain. Well, if we look at that historically, that still existed then in that period in our history. So architects, the Pentagon, right near where you guys are, the Pentagon was designed with too many bathrooms because it's in Virginia. At the time that it was built, it had separate bathrooms. So it was designed with just too many bathrooms for that reason. Same with these nice, beautiful, architecturally significant big houses. Same concept, same idea. Still segregation, still the desire to have these people function within that space. And again, if you want them to be seen, they can be seen. Those are the ones that you would dress in the clothing that you bought from Brooks Brothers, because the Brooks Brothers, they made clothing that enslavers bought for their enslaved people. The one that wanted to be seen, they wanted to be seen. Nice Brooks Brothers. They also sold a more inferior cloth for the field hands, but that's another story. But if you are entertaining, which a lot of those folks of that period were doing often, there is an element of the enslaved population that you want to let your public see. But there's some you don't. But and designed into those houses is the ability to do that, to have these folks function. The thing they call a dumbwaiter. That's a part, that's a part of that architecture, that part of that ability to still have that place function. Now, if you want a little child to be seen, you're going to dress him appropriately, and you're going to put him on at the end of that table to operate that punka that's over that table, that's swinging back and forth to provide some breeze and keep flies away. There's going to be somebody in there doing that. So that's why I say, always look for that second set of stairs. And now another thing we gotta look for is this. A lot of times when people restore historic buildings, antebellum buildings, they eliminated that from with the way the house looks now. But sometimes those stairs still exist. They just close it in. They maybe for whatever reason. Sometimes it's they don't want to be reminded of that, what they were used for. So a lot of times you can go into a lot of these houses, these nice, beautiful antebellum houses that were built during that period, and expose those hidden features of some of these places. Just know that the business part of that house, that nice, beautiful house, was in the back, where the enslaved people inhabited, where the carriage houses were, where the kitchen was. And a lot of people today, Charleston, good example, these places transitioned for them. They built what these things called L's, just connected the two places, and it expands their square footage of their nice, beautiful home that fronts the street. Yeah, another thing to look for in Charleston is this: if you see the house number on that faces the street, then you see another number maybe on the next fence post. If it has a half number, what that means is once upon a time that half number was the slave dwellings, or where the enslaved once inhabited. It could have been a carriage house that they have now converted into a place for people to live. So there's that. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that it's definitely, that was probably our last question, but a good things to look for, particularly since DC had a lot of urban enslavement as well. So to look in the hidden places, I think, is a good note to leave on. But thank you so much, Joe, for our participants. I'll send out the link with the recording and information about Joe, and potentially the link for his book as well. So thank you so much.
You are welcome. It's been a pleasure. And thank you guys for the questions.
Yeah, of course. All right, well, have a great night, everybody. Thank you. Bye.